Good evening and welcome, humble viewer. Find a comfortable space, a quiet corner in your part of the world. Take a moment. We are about to look back at a name so famous it became a word for power itself. As you settle in, perhaps leave a comment with the time on your clock and the city or country you're in. It is a small way to mark our place in the present before we journey to a past where the actions of a single man would forever alter the course of Western civilization, carving a wound so deep that its scar can still be traced on the body of the world. The name is Caesar. It is a name that echoes with triumph, with genius, with the image of a conquering hero wreathed in laurel, his hand outstretched to a grateful populace. We are told he was the greatest Roman of them all, the man who brought order from chaos and laid the foundations of an empire that would last 1,000 years. But what is a hero to one man if he is a monster to another? What is order if its price is liberty? To understand why Gaius Julius Caesar was seen by his contemporaries not as a savior, but as a tyrant, the very thing a Roman was taught from birth to despise, we must set aside the legends that have been polished by 2 millennia of admiration. We must look not at what he built, but at what he broke. For 500 years, the Roman Republic had been defined by a single foundational terror, the terror of a king. The Latin word rex was not a title, it was a curse. They had built their entire complex system of government, a delicate clockwork of shared power, of yearly elections, of collegiate offices, of senatorial authority and popular vetoes, on one sacred, inviolable principle that no single man should ever again hold absolute authority in Rome. This fear was the Republic's soul. Caesar, with methodical brilliance and terrifying ambition, ripped that soul from its body. And the beginning of the end, the moment the fever broke and the terminal illness began, has a name: the Rubicon. It was a small, insignificant river in northern Italy, a muddy stream you could wade across without effort. But in the Roman mind, it was a line as absolute as the division between life and death. It was the sacred legal boundary, the pomerium of the city of Rome's authority. By ancient and sacred law, no serving general, no holder of military command, imperium, was permitted to cross it at the head of a standing army. To do so was not merely illegal, it was an act of sacrilege. It was an armed declaration of war against the Senate and the people of Rome. It was the ultimate crime a Roman could commit, an act of treason. To truly grasp the enormity of this transgression, we must first understand the political DNA of the republic he was about to strangle. The story the Romans told themselves about their own origins was not one of gentle progress, but of violent liberation. They looked back to the year 509 BC, to the reign of the 7th and final king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He was, in their national narrative, the archetypal tyrant, arrogant, cruel, and contemptuous of law and tradition. The catalyst for the revolution was a deeply personal violation that became a national trauma: the rape of the noblewoman Lucretia by the king's son. In the Roman telling, Lucretia, after revealing the crime to her husband and father, took her own life in a tragic act of honor. Her death was not just a private sorrow, it was a public call to arms. A kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, was said to have drawn the bloody dagger from her chest and, holding it aloft, swore a sacred oath before the gods and the people. He swore that never again would a king rule in Rome. He and his fellow conspirators roused the populace, expelled Tarquin and his family, and established a new form of government, the res publica, the public thing, or commonwealth. This founding myth, whether historically accurate in every detail or not, was the bedrock of Roman political identity for half a millennium. The oath of Brutus was taught to every schoolboy. The names of the early heroes of the Republic were those who fought and died to prevent the return of the Tarquins. The fear of a rex was visceral. It shaped their every political institution. They replaced the single, lifelong king with 2 consuls, chief executives who were elected annually. 2, so that one could always check the ambition of the other, each holding the power of veto, intercessio, over his colleagues' actions. Their power, their imperium, lasted only 1 year, after which they returned to the status of private citizens and could be held accountable for their actions in office. This principle of collegiality and annuality was replicated throughout the cursus honorum, the sequential path of public offices a Roman nobleman was expected to follow. Praetors who served as judges, quaestors who managed the treasury, aediles who oversaw public works, all were elected, all served in colleges of multiple members, and all for limited terms. Power was deliberately fractured, diluted, and set in constant opposition to itself to prevent its concentration in any one pair of hands. The Senate, a council of elders composed of former magistrates, held immense influence, auctoritas. But it could not pass binding laws on its own. It could only advise and guide. True legislative power rested with the people, assembled in their various voting assemblies, like the Comitia Centuriata or the Comitia Tributa. And as a final brilliant check on the power of the aristocratic Senate and magistrates, the Republic created the office of the Tribune of the Plebs. These 10 men, elected by the common people, were themselves sacrosancti, their persons were legally inviolable, and they held the extraordinary power to veto any act of a magistrate or any decree of the Senate that they deemed harmful to the interests of the plebeians. The entire system was a masterpiece of constitutional checks and balances, designed with a paranoid genius to thwart the rise of a new king. It was this 500-year-old system, this sacred inheritance, that Caesar would be asked to respect as he stood on the banks of the Rubicon. But the republic that Caesar confronted was not the healthy, virtuous state of its founding myth. It was a sick and dying patient, afflicted by a century of social and political cancers that had hollowed out its institutions from within. The disease began, as it so often does, with money and land. The vast wealth that poured into Rome from its overseas conquests in the 2nd century BC had created staggering inequality. A new class of super-wealthy senators and businessmen, the equites, amassed enormous estates, the latifundia, often by buying up or pushing out the small-scale citizen farmers who had been the traditional backbone of the Roman army and society. These dispossessed farmers flocked to the city of Rome, forming a volatile, impoverished, and resentful urban proletariat, dependent on handouts and easily manipulated by ambitious demagogues. The first figures to truly try and address this crisis were the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, in the 130s and 120s BC. Acting as tribunes of the plebs, they proposed land reforms to redistribute public land to the poor. The conservative elite in the Senate, the self-styled optimates or best men, saw this as a revolutionary attack on their property and power. Rather than engaging in political compromise, they resorted to a brutal new tactic: political violence. Tiberius Gracchus and hundreds of his followers were clubbed to death in a mob riot instigated by senators. A decade later, his brother Gaius and thousands of his supporters were killed after the Senate passed the first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree of the Senate, a form of martial law that empowered the consuls to see to it that the state suffered no harm, effectively authorizing them to execute Roman citizens without trial. The murders of the Gracchi brothers broke a foundational taboo of the Republic. Political disputes would no longer be settled only in the forum with votes and speeches, but in the streets with clubs and daggers. The door to civil bloodshed had been kicked open. The next great shock to the system came from a military man, Gaius Marius. A new man, novus homo, from outside the traditional aristocracy, Marius reformed the Roman army to solve a manpower crisis. He abolished the property requirement for military service, allowing the landless urban poor, the capita censi, to enlist. In doing so, he created a professional army, but he also fundamentally changed its nature. These new soldiers were no longer citizen farmers serving a temporary tour of duty out of civic obligation. They were career soldiers, poor men for whom the army was their only livelihood. Their loyalty was not to the abstract ideal of the Senate and people of Rome, but to their general, the man who led them to victory, who promised them plunder from conquered enemies, and, most critically, who would fight for them back in Rome to secure the land grants they needed for their retirement. Marius had, inadvertently, created the tool by which the Republic would be destroyed, the private army loyal to a charismatic commander rather than the state. The The terrifying potential of this new army was unleashed in the 80s BC during the first full-scale civil war fought between Marius and his aristocratic rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla, in 88 BC, committed the ultimate sin that Caesar would later replicate. He marched his legions on Rome to settle a political dispute, the first Roman to do so in the city's long history. The civil wars that followed were horrifically brutal. After his final victory, Sulla declared himself dictator legibus faciendis et rei publicae constituendae causa, dictator for the making of laws and for the settling of the constitution. Unlike the traditional Roman dictatorship, which was a temporary 6-month emergency office, Sulla's was for an unlimited term. He used this absolute power to unleash the proscriptions, a legalized campaign of mass murder. He posted lists of his political enemies in the forum. Anyone on the list was stripped of their citizenship, their property was confiscated by the state, and they could be killed with impunity by anyone, with a reward offered for their heads. Thousands of wealthy Romans were murdered, their fortunes used to pay Sulla's troops. Sulla eventually, to the astonishment of all, laid down his dictatorial power and retired to private life, restoring the traditional republican constitution, albeit one he had heavily modified to favor the Senate. But the damage was irreparable. Sulla had provided a horrifyingly successful blueprint for future ambitious men. He had demonstrated that a powerful general with a loyal army could not only defy the Senate, but could march on the capital, seize absolute power, eliminate his enemies, and rewrite the laws of the state to suit his own purposes. The precedent was set. The question was no longer if another strongman would try, but when and who it would be. All of Rome looked to the next generation and saw two towering figures, Gnaeus Pompeius, Magnus, Pompey the Great, Sulla's brilliant young butcher, and a rising young politician from an old but recently unremarkable patrician family, a man known for his charm, his intellect, his populist rhetoric, and his staggering debts, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar's own early career was a masterclass in exploiting the cracks in the dying republic. He consciously styled himself as a populist, a popularis, in the tradition of Marius, to whom he was related by marriage, championing the cause of the common people against the senatorial elite. But his populism was a tool, a means to achieve personal power. His ambition was limitless, as was his appetite for risk. In 60 BC, he engineered the most cynical and subversive political deal in Roman history, the First Triumvirate. This was not a formal office of state, it was a private pact, a secret handshake between the three most powerful men in Rome: Caesar, the brilliant politician with a loyal following among the urban poor; Pompey, the most celebrated general of his age with a vast army of veteran soldiers demanding land; and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, a property magnate and power broker. Together, they formed a three-headed monster, pledging to use their combined influence, wealth, and military muscle to block any legislation they didn't like, and to force through any measures that served their own interests. They effectively hijacked the state, rendering the Senate's authority and the people's votes largely irrelevant. The Triumvirate's first major act was to secure the consulship for Caesar in 59 BC. His year in office was a constitutional travesty, when his consular colleague, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a staunch optimate, tried to oppose his radical land reform bills by using his veto and declaring all further days of business to be holy days, a common form of legislative filibuster. Caesar simply ignored him. He brought his legislation directly to the popular assemblies, bypassing the Senate entirely. When Bibulus and other senators tried to intervene, they were driven from the forum by armed gangs of Pompey's veterans. Bibulus was so intimidated that he spent the rest of his consulship locked inside his house, effectively leaving Caesar as the sole unchecked ruler of Rome. It was a year of naked force and legal subversion, a dress rehearsal for his later autocracy. But Caesar knew that a single year as consul was not enough. He needed a long-term military command, a proconsulship that would give him an army, an opportunity for military glory, gloria, and the immense wealth needed to pay off his debts and secure a network of political clients. Using the power of the Triumvirate, he had himself assigned an extraordinary 5-year command over the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, and Illyricum, the coast of modern-day Croatia. Then the governorship of Transalpine Gaul, southern France, was conveniently added. This command was his springboard. For the next 8 years, from 58 to 50 BC, Caesar waged the Gallic Wars. The official justification for these wars, as presented in Caesar's own brilliant propaganda masterpiece, De Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, was the defense of Roman allies and the preemptive neutralization of threats to Roman territory. The reality was a brutal and largely unprovoked war of conquest, initiated and sustained by Caesar for his own personal and political advantage. He pushed far beyond the boundaries of his assigned provinces, methodically subjugating hundreds of independent Gallic and Germanic tribes. His campaigns were models of military genius, but they were also exercises in genocide. Ancient sources, such as Plutarch, estimate that in 8 years of fighting, Caesar's legions killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved another million. Entire tribes were wiped from existence. The wealth he plundered from Gallic towns and sacred groves was astronomical. He used this river of blood money to pay his soldiers lavishly, ensuring their absolute personal loyalty. He also used it to maintain a vast network of agents and political allies back in Rome, bribing key officials and funding public works to keep his name in the minds of the people. By the end of the wars, Caesar possessed 4 key assets that made him the most dangerous man in the world. A massive, battle-hardened army of veterans who adored him, an almost inexhaustible personal fortune, a reputation for military invincibility, and a burning sense of his own superior dignitas, his prestige, his worthiness to command. As the 50s BC drew to a close, the triumvirate fell apart. Crassus was killed fighting the Parthians in the east, his death a military disaster that removed one of the key pillars of the political arrangement. The bond between Caesar and Pompey had also frayed. Pompey's wife, Julia, who was Caesar's daughter, had died in childbirth, severing their most important personal link. Now back in Rome, Pompey grew increasingly wary of his former allies' staggering success and power. He gradually drifted into an alliance with the conservative optimates in the Senate, the very men who had been his and Caesar's bitterest enemies. They saw Pompey as the lesser of two evils, the one man with the military prestige to act as a counterweight to the conqueror of Gaul. They made him sole consul in 52 BC, a clear violation of the principle of collegiality, to restore order after a period of intense gang violence in the city. The trap for Caesar was being set. The legal showdown came in 50 BC. Caesar's proconsular command was due to expire. He wanted to stand for the consulship for a second time, but he wanted to do so in absentia, without having to enter Rome as a private citizen. His enemies in the Senate, led by figures like Cato the Younger, a man of rigid and uncompromising republican principle, were determined to prevent this. They insisted that he must first lay down his command and disband his army outside the city, and then return as a private individual to stand for election. This would create a fatal gap of several months in which Caesar would have no imperium to protect him. In that window, he would be a private citizen, vulnerable to the myriad of lawsuits his enemies were preparing to launch against him for his illegal acts during his first consulship and his unauthorized wars in Gaul. Prosecution meant political ruin, exile, and the stripping of his wealth and dignitas. For a man like Caesar, such a fate was worse than death. He saw it as a deliberate attempt to humiliate him and destroy him. He negotiated furiously through his agents in Rome, proposing compromises. He offered to give up all his provinces and all but 1 or 2 of his legions if Pompey would do the same with his command in Spain. The Senate, now firmly under the influence of his hardline enemies, refused. In early January of 49 BC, they passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, effectively declaring Caesar an enemy of the state and giving Pompey the authority to raise troops to defend the Republic. The tribunes of the plebs who supported Caesar, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, used their veto to block the decree, but they were threatened with violence and forced to flee the city for their lives. They fled north to Caesar's camp at Ravenna. This was the final provocation. The flight of the tribunes gave Caesar the perfect pretext, a legalistic cloak for his planned insurrection. He could now claim that he was not marching on Rome for his own ambition, but to defend the sacred rights of the tribunes of the plebs and to restore the true liberty of the Roman people from a corrupt and lawless senatorial faction. He gathered the soldiers of his 13th Legion, a unit that had been with him for years, men who owed him everything. He delivered a fiery speech detailing the injustices and humiliations heaped upon him by his enemies, and highlighting the violence done to the sacrosanct tribunes. He asked his soldiers if they would defend his honor and their own. Their response was a roar of unanimous support. This is the context for that fateful moment on the northern bank of the Rubicon. It was not a spontaneous decision. It was the calculated culmination of a decade of planning, of ambition, of violence, and of the systematic subversion of the Republic's laws and norms. Caesar, the brilliant populist, the military genius, the master propagandist, now stood at the brink. He knew, with absolute clarity, the choice before him. He could submit to the laws of the Republic as they stood, and in doing so, face his own political and personal annihilation at the hands of his enemies. Or he could defy those laws, cross that river, and plunge the Roman world into a cataclysmic civil war, a war from which the Republic would never recover. He was betting his life, the lives of his men, and the fate of civilization on the belief that his own dignitas was more important than the 500-year-old constitution of his country. The ancient historian Suetonius tells us he hesitated. He turned to his staff and said, "Even now we can still turn back, but once we have crossed that little bridge, everything will have to be decided by arms." He had a vision, or a dream, of a great figure beckoning him across. The choice was made. He spurred his horse forward, uttering the famous chilling words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. This was not the statement of a hero saving the state. It was the gambler's cry, the admission of a man pushing all his chips onto the table, knowing that the outcome would be either total victory or total ruin. In that single act of crossing a shallow stream, Caesar committed the ultimate act of tyranny in the Roman mind. He deliberately and consciously initiated a civil war to preserve his own power and honor. He was marching his private army on his own country. The laws of the Republic, the authority of the Senate, the delicate balance of power so carefully constructed by generations of ancestors, all of it was washed away in the muddy waters of that small river. The shadow of a king, a rex, had fallen across Rome, and the ghost of the Republic, bleeding from 1,000 previous cuts, was now dealt its mortal wound. The age of tyrants had begun. The casting of the die was not followed by the thunder of battle, but by a terrifying silence, and then by panic. The speed of Caesar's advance into Italy was a weapon in itself, a psychological blitzkrieg that shattered the resolve of his opponents before their armies could even properly assemble. He did not march as a brutish conqueror, leaving a trail of fire and ruin. He moved with a chilling and deliberate precision, a man who understood that the first stage of this war would be fought not for territory, but for legitimacy. As he swept south, town after town opened its gates to him, their garrisons defecting, their civic leaders welcoming him. His enemies, the senatorial faction led by Pompey, had expected a slow, lumbering approach, giving them time to raise legions from the deep reserves of Italian manpower. They had gravely miscalculated not just Caesar's military speed, but the power of his name and the exhaustion of a populace that had no stomach for another Sullan-style civil war. The government of the Republic effectively dissolved in a matter of weeks. The consuls, the praetors, and a great majority of the Senate, including Pompey himself and the arch-conservative Cato, abandoned the city of Rome, the heart of their own empire, and fled south, hoping to cross the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where Pompey could rally his veteran legions from the east and prepare a counterattack. The flight of the Senate was a catastrophic propaganda defeat. How could they claim to be the legitimate government of Rome when they had abandoned the city to the very man they decried as a public enemy? Caesar entered his capital not as a conqueror laying siege, but as a master returning to an empty house. He walked into the state treasury at the Temple of Saturn, and when a brave tribune named Lucius Metellus tried to physically bar his way, Caesar brushed him aside with a threat that laid bare the new reality. "Young man," he is reported to have said, "it is harder for me to say this than to do it." He was threatening to kill a sacrosanct tribune in the heart of Rome. The law was whatever he willed it to be. He seized the state's reserves of gold and silver, the very wealth he would now use to wage war on the state itself. But it was in the towns of Italy, on his march south, that Caesar deployed the most insidious and effective weapon in his tyrannical arsenal. It was not a siege engine or a new tactic, but a concept: clementia, clemency, mercy. This single word would become the cornerstone of his public image and the most subtle and corrosive tool of his autocracy. The memory of the last great civil wars was fresh and raw. The generation before had lived through the horrors of Marius and Sulla. They remembered the prescription lists, the state-sanctioned murder, the confiscation of property, the endless cycle of revenge. Everyone expected Caesar, the heir to Marius, to unleash a similar bloodbath upon his enemies. And at the town of Corfinium, he was given his first great test. Here, one of his most bitter and stubborn political enemies, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, had gathered a substantial force of newly recruited troops, determined to make a stand. Caesar surrounded the town, and after a brief siege, Ahenobarbus's own soldiers, unwilling to fight and die for a lost cause, arrested him and the other senators with him and prepared to hand them over. This was the moment everyone was waiting for. Ahenobarbus was not just any senator. He had been nominated to be Caesar's successor in Gaul and had sworn to destroy him. By all the bloody precedents of Roman history, his execution was a foregone conclusion. His own soldiers expected it. He himself expected it. Instead, Caesar did something utterly disarming. He summoned the captured senators and high-ranking officers, gave them a stern lecture in which he chastised them for their ingratitude and poor judgment, and then he pardoned them. All of them. He returned the treasury that Ahenobarbus had with him. He protected their property, and he allowed them to walk away, free men. This act of calculated magnanimity sent a shockwave across Italy. It was a masterstroke of political warfare. On the surface, it was an act of noble forbearance, a gesture that seemed to promise a civil war without the horror of civil butchery. But beneath the surface, the Clementia Caesaris was a profound instrument of tyrannical power. To understand why, one must understand the Roman concept of social relationships. Roman society was built on a vertical axis of patronage and clientage. A powerful man, the patronus, granted favors, legal protection, and financial support to a host of lesser men, his clientes, who in turn owed him their loyalty, their political support, and their public deference. It was a system of reciprocal obligation. By pardoning Ahenobarbus and the others, Caesar was not treating them as political equals who had lost a contest. He was forcibly casting himself in the role of the ultimate patron, and every single one of his defeated enemies in the role of a client. He was not forgiving them, he was placing them in his debt. To accept Caesar's pardon was to acknowledge his superiority and to accept a personal obligation to him that superseded any loyalty to the abstract idea of the Republic. It created a new hierarchy in the Roman world, a hierarchy based not on law or election, but on a personal relationship to a single man. You were either with Caesar or you were a recipient of his mercy, and therefore you belonged to him. It also had a devastating psychological effect on his opponents. How do you rally men to fight to the death against a tyrant who refuses to kill you? How do you create martyrs when the enemy insists on sending you home unharmed? Many of the men Caesar pardoned, including Ahenobarbus, would go on to fight him again, a fact he surely anticipated. But that didn't matter. The initial act of clemency had already done its work. It had established the narrative. Caesar was the reasonable, magnanimous statesman, while his opponents were bitter, stubborn extremists, willing to tear the state apart out of personal animosity. He was weaponizing virtue, turning mercy into a tool of subjugation. While Pompey and the Senate established their base in Greece, Caesar knew he could not follow them immediately. The Pompeian navy controlled the seas, and more importantly, Pompey's most powerful and experienced legions, 7 of them, were stationed in Spain, a province he had governed for years. To leave these armies intact at his back while he pursued Pompey to the east would be a strategic blunder of the highest order. So, in an astonishing display of energy and strategic vision, Caesar decided to secure the entire Western Mediterranean first. He famously remarked, "I am going to fight an army without a general, and then I will return to fight a general without an army." He left Mark Antony in charge of Italy and marched his legions overland through Gaul and across the Pyrenees into Spain. Along the way, he was forced to deal with the city of Massilia, modern-day Marseille. Massilia was an ancient Greek city, a loyal ally of Rome for centuries, that wished to remain neutral in this Roman civil war. They barred their gates to Caesar's forces. For Caesar, neutrality was not an option. Your city was either a tool for his use or an obstacle to be removed. His will was absolute. He left part of his army behind to conduct a brutal siege of the city, a siege that involved incredible feats of engineering from massive siege towers to protected galleries, and pressed on into Spain. The fall of Massilia was another object lesson to the world. There was no middle ground in Caesar's war. The conflict was total. In Spain, at the town of Ilerda, Caesar confronted the Pompeian legions, commanded by 2 loyal legates. He was outnumbered and initially found himself in a difficult strategic position, his supply lines cut by spring floods. For a moment, it seemed his legendary luck might have run out. But through a combination of brilliant engineering, he had his soldiers build light, skin-covered boats of a type he had seen in Britain to re-establish communications. Relentless maneuvering and the sheer force of his reputation, he gradually cornered the Pompeian armies, cutting them off from their water and food supplies. Crucially, he avoided a direct, bloody, pitched battle. He did not want to needlessly sacrifice his own veterans or slaughter Roman soldiers who might one day be his own. His goal was not annihilation, but surrender. He wanted to win them over. He engaged in a campaign of psychological warfare, allowing his soldiers to fraternize with the enemy troops, reminding them that they were all Romans, that this was a senseless war caused by a few stubborn senators. Eventually, trapped and demoralized, the entire Pompeian army in Spain surrendered to him without a major fight. And again, he deployed his clementia. He did not punish or execute. He disbanded their army, sending some of the soldiers home and incorporating the rest into his own legions. In a single, swift campaign of less than 2 months, he had eliminated the most significant military threat in the West and doubled the size of his own forces. The first half of his prediction was complete. Now, at last, he could turn his full attention to the general without an army. The year was now 48 BC. Caesar returned to Rome, where he had himself appointed dictator for the first time, a temporary measure to allow him to hold consular elections, which he, of course, won. Now, with the legal authority of a consul, he prepared for the ultimate confrontation. The logistical challenge was immense. Pompey's fleet, commanded by Caesar's old enemy Bibulus, dominated the Adriatic Sea. His army, encamped in Greece, was a formidable force composed of his own veterans supplemented by legions raised from all over the eastern provinces, supported by vast contingents of allied cavalry and archers. Caesar's army was smaller, his navy almost non-existent. In the dead of winter, a notoriously dangerous time for sailing, Caesar made his move. In a typically audacious gamble, he crammed as many troops as he could onto what few transport ships he had and slipped across the Adriatic, landing his first wave of troops on the Greek coast. He had made it across, but he was now trapped with only half his army, insufficient supplies, and Pompey's much larger force between him and his landing beach. The situation was desperate. Mark Antony, with the remaining legions, was stuck in Italy, unable to cross due to the Pompeian blockade. What followed was a months-long stalemate of incredible tension. Caesar's army, camped near the town of Dyrrhachium, suffered from severe food shortages, forced to subsist on a strange type of root bread, while Pompey's camp was easily resupplied by sea. Caesar tried to blockade Pompey's much larger army by constructing an astonishing line of fortifications, a wall of circumvallation over 15 miles long. It was a bluff, an act of supreme audacity designed to conceal his own weakness. But Pompey was a cautious general. He refused to be drawn into a pitched battle on Caesar's terms. Finally, he broke the stalemate. Using intelligence from defectors, Pompey launched a surprise attack on a weak point in Caesar's siege lines, routing his legions and inflicting a major defeat. For the first time in a decade, Caesar's soldiers broke and fled in panic. Caesar himself rode among them, trying to rally them, grabbing standards from fleeing soldiers, but it was no use. The defeat was total. He had lost nearly 1,000 of his best veterans, dozens of centurions, and several standards. Plutarch claims that as Caesar retreated in disarray, he told his friends, "The war would have ended today if the enemy had a commander who knew how to win." He believed that if Pompey had pressed his advantage with more aggression, his army would have been completely destroyed. The aura of invincibility had been shattered. Caesar, the gambler, had lost a major hand. This defeat at Dyrrhachium was the low point of his career, but it also demonstrated the core of his tyrannical will, his absolute refusal to accept the verdict of fate or the rules of conventional warfare. Defeated, he did not surrender or retreat to Italy. He did the unexpected. He disengaged and marched his weary army inland into the plains of Thessaly, deliberately moving away from the sea and his supply lines. It was a desperate move, designed to lure Pompey away from his coastal advantage and onto open ground where the quality of Caesar's infantry might prove decisive. Pompey's officers and the attendant senators in his camp, overconfident after their victory, were euphoric. They urged him to pursue Caesar and finish him off. Pompey, ever the cautious commander, was hesitant. He knew the quality of Caesar's veterans. He preferred a strategy of attrition, of using his naval supremacy and superior numbers to slowly starve Caesar's army into submission. But he was no longer a free agent. He was the commander of a coalition of arrogant, squabbling Roman nobles, each of whom saw himself as a master strategist. They mocked his caution, calling him Agamemnon, King of Kings, because he seemed reluctant to end a war that gave him command over so many important men. They were already arguing amongst themselves over the spoils of the victory they had not yet won, squabbling over who would get Caesar's prestigious office of Pontifex Maximus. Pressured by these political masters, Pompey made the fatal mistake of his life. Against his better judgment, he followed Caesar into the plains of Thessaly. The final tragic confrontation came on August 9th, 48 BC, on a flat plain near the town of Pharsalus. The fate of the Roman world would be decided here by Roman swords wielded against Roman bodies. The scene was a tableau of the Republic's death agony. On one side stood Pompey the Great, the champion of the Senate, his army outnumbering Caesar's by more than 2-1, particularly in cavalry. With him were more than 200 senators, including the great orator Cicero and many of the most distinguished names in Roman history. On the other side stood Caesar, the rebel, the traitor, with his hardened veterans of the Gallic Wars. He was acutely aware of the historical gravity of the moment. As he rode past his lines before the battle, he called on his men to remember his constant efforts to avoid this, to remember that it was the enemy who had forced this fight. The battle itself was a testament to his tactical genius. Knowing Pompey's plan was to use his massive cavalry advantage to overwhelm his right flank, Caesar secretly detached a small number of his best cohorts and hid them behind his own line as a fourth reserve line. As the battle began, the Pompeian cavalry charged as expected. Caesar's own meager cavalry force gave way, luring them in. Then, Caesar gave the signal. The hidden fourth line of infantry, ordered not to throw their javelins but to use them as stabbing spears aimed at the faces and eyes of the horsemen, charged forward. The effect was devastating. The elite Pompeian cavalry, composed of young, wealthy nobles who prized their handsome faces as much as their lives, could not stand up to this brutal, disfiguring attack. They broke and fled in a wild panic, leaving the left flank of Pompey's infantry completely exposed. Caesar then unleashed his final reserve, attacking the now vulnerable flank and rear of the Pompeian line. At the same time, his veteran infantry in the center, who had been patiently holding their ground, launched a ferocious frontal assault. The Pompeian legions, composed of less experienced recruits, buckled and then collapsed. The battle turned into a rout, a slaughter. Pompey, seeing his cavalry flee and his legions crumble, seemed to suffer a complete mental collapse. He rode back to his camp, walked into his tent, and sat in stunned silence as Caesar's men stormed the fortifications. In the aftermath of his overwhelming victory, Caesar once again deployed his clementia, but this time it was on a grander, more terrible scale. Riding over the battlefield, littered with the bodies of the thousands of Roman soldiers who had been killed, he is said to have remarked with a calculated sadness, "They would have it so." It was a chillingly effective line, simultaneously expressing regret while absolving himself of all responsibility. He had won, but he had won at the cost of the Roman Republic's own lifeblood. He gave orders to spare the lives of all Roman citizens who surrendered, and many of the high-ranking senators on the opposing side, including a grim-faced Marcus Junius Brutus, were pardoned and accepted into his service. This act, again, was not the restoration of a republic of equals, it was the imposition of a monarchy of the indebted. He had defeated the armies of the Senate, and now he was collecting the senators themselves as his political dependents. Pompey the Great, however, escaped. He fled the field, disguised as a commoner, and made his way to the coast, eventually sailing for Egypt. He hoped to find refuge there. The kingdom of the Ptolemies was a Roman client state, and Pompey himself had been a great patron to the father of the current child king, Ptolemy XIII. But the Egyptian court, run by a cabal of eunuchs and advisors, saw not a great Roman general seeking aid, but a dangerous liability. They feared that granting him sanctuary would draw the wrath of the victorious Caesar. They also saw an opportunity to curry favor with the new master of the Roman world. As Pompey's small boat rowed towards the shore at Pelusium, he was met by one of his own former officers, a Roman named Septimius, who was now in the service of the Egyptian king. As Pompey stood to disembark, Septimius and the others stabbed him to death, in full view of his wife and son watching from the ship offshore. His body was unceremoniously dumped in the surf, his head and signet ring taken as trophies. It was a squalid, pathetic end for the man who had been Rome's most celebrated conqueror. A few days later, Caesar arrived in Alexandria with a small force in hot pursuit. He was presented with the ultimate proof of his victory, Pompey's severed head and his signet ring. His reaction was one of the most famous pieces of political theatre in his career. He recoiled in horror and wept. Were these the genuine tears of a man mourning a former son-in-law, a one-time ally, a great Roman whose life had ended so wretchedly? Or was it the supreme frustration of a tyrant whose grandest gesture had been stolen from him? Pompey's ignominious murder had denied Caesar the final, ultimate performance of his clementia. He could not pardon a dead man. The chance to publicly display his magnanimity over his greatest rival, to bind the entire Pompeian faction to him through the symbolic pardon of their leader, was gone. The Egyptians, in their clumsy attempt to please him, had misunderstood the very nature of his power. He did not want Pompey dead. He wanted him defeated, humbled, and indebted. He wanted to own his submission. By killing Pompey, the Egyptian court had robbed Caesar of the capstone of his tyrannical pyramid. The civil war for control of the Roman state was over. Caesar was the undisputed master. He had achieved this position through treason, through civil war, and through a brilliant, cynical manipulation of mercy that destroyed the very foundations of republican fellowship. He was not a president, not a consul among equals. He was a master who had pardoned his slaves. The republic had not been saved, it had been conquered. The head of Pompey the Great, presented in a dusty crate on the docks of Alexandria, was meant to be a tribute. It was a clumsy, sycophantic offering from the ministers of a frightened client kingdom to the new master of the Roman world. But in their haste to please, they had profoundly misunderstood the nature of the man they sought to appease. Caesar's tears, whether genuine or theatrical, were for a lost opportunity. The death of Pompey had robbed him of his final and most potent political performance, the pardon of his great rival. Clemency, his signature weapon, had been rendered useless. He could not grant mercy to a severed head. He could not place a dead man in his debt. The cycle of civil war, which he had hoped to conclude with a grand gesture of personal magnanimity that would elevate him above all others, had ended instead in a squalid assassination by foreigners. The narrative had been stolen from him. This frustration, this denial of his ultimate power to give life as well as take it, would set the stage for the next phase of his tyrannical ascent. He had arrived in Egypt in pursuit of a Roman enemy. He would stay as the arbiter of a foreign kingdom, remaking a nation in his own image and, in the process, beginning to see himself not as a Roman magistrate, but as something else entirely. Something older, more absolute, more divine. Egypt in 48 BC was a kingdom tearing itself apart. It was nominally independent, but for decades it had been a client state of Rome, a pawn in the Republic's power games, surviving only by the grace of its powerful patrons. The throne was jointly held by two teenagers, the children of the late King Ptolemy XII, Auletes, whom Pompey himself had once supported. The boy, Ptolemy XIII, was about 13 years old. His sister, Cleopatra VII, was around 21. They were bound by their father's will and by ancient Egyptian tradition to marry each other and rule as co-monarchs. But the court at Alexandria was a viper's nest of intrigue, run by a cabal of powerful figures who governed in the young king's name: Pothinus the eunuch, his chief minister; Achilles, the general of the Egyptian army; and Theodotus of Chios, the king's tutor. They saw the ambitious and intelligent Cleopatra as a threat to their control over the boy king. They had driven her out of Alexandria, and now a civil war simmered between the forces loyal to the king, concentrated in the capital, and the army Cleopatra had raised in the east. Into this purely internal power struggle walked Gaius Julius Caesar. He arrived not as a neutral observer, but as a Roman consul, and he brought with him the arrogant assumption that a Roman consul had the right to settle the affairs of lesser nations. He declared that as the representative of the Roman people, he would act as the executor of the late king's will and arbitrate the dispute between the royal siblings. This was an act of breathtaking imperial arrogance. He had no legal mandate from the Senate, the body he had effectively dismantled, to interfere. He was acting solely on his own authority, his will being the only law that now mattered. He summoned both Ptolemy and Cleopatra to appear before him in the royal palace at Alexandria, which he had commandeered as his headquarters. The king's party, already in the city, seethed with resentment but had little choice but to comply. Caesar was the man who had just destroyed Pompey the Great. His small contingent of around 4,000 soldiers was dwarfed by the 20,000 troops of the Egyptian royal army under Achilles. But Caesar's name and the shadow of his legions carried more weight than any number of men. Cleopatra, however, faced a problem. She was outside the city, and the forces loyal to her brother controlled the harbour and all approaches. She could not simply appear at the palace gates. What followed is one of the most celebrated and revealing anecdotes of the ancient world. Understanding that she could not win this contest through force of arms, she chose another weapon: audacity. She travelled by boat to Alexandria and, according to the famous story told by Plutarch, had herself rolled up inside a bed sack or a large carpet. A loyal servant, Apollodorus the Sicilian, carried this bundle on his shoulders through the enemy-controlled streets, past the royal guards, and directly into Caesar's private chambers. There, he unrolled his bundle and out-tumbled the young queen. This was not merely a dramatic entrance, it was a political masterstroke. It was an act of total submission that was also an act of supreme confidence. She was placing her life, her fate, entirely in Caesar's hands, demonstrating in the most personal way possible that she recognized him, and him alone, as the source of all power in her world. She bypassed the entire structure of the Roman state, ignoring the Senate and the consuls, and appealed directly to the man himself. In doing so, she was tacitly acknowledging the death of the Republic and the birth of a new, personal autocracy. She saw, with a clarity that eluded many Romans, that the world was no longer governed by committees and laws, but by the will of a single, extraordinary individual. She was also, of course, a woman of legendary charm and intellect. Caesar, 52 years old, a man whose romantic life was as extensive as his military career, was immediately captivated. He was impressed by her courage, her intelligence, her ambition, which mirrored his own. That night, she became his lover. The political became personal. He had found in this Egyptian queen a partner whose vision of monarchy was as grand and as absolute as the one beginning to form in his own mind. The next morning, Caesar summoned the young Ptolemy XIII and informed him that he would reconcile him with his sister and that they would rule together as their father's will had stipulated. The boy king and his advisor, Pothinus, were enraged. When Ptolemy saw his sister in the palace, a woman he believed to be his enemy, now clearly on intimate terms with the Roman general who was supposed to be an impartial judge, he flew into a childish rage. He ran out into the streets, tore the diadem from his head, and screamed to the crowds that he had been betrayed. Pothinus used this moment to ignite the simmering anti-Roman sentiment of the Alexandrian mob. He spread rumors that Caesar intended to depose Ptolemy and make Cleopatra his puppet ruler, turning Egypt into a Roman province. The city, a volatile melting pot of Greeks, Egyptians, and Jews, erupted into violence. The Egyptian general Achilles marched his 20,000-strong army into the city, trapping Caesar and his single legion in the royal quarter. The Alexandrian War had begun, a war that Caesar had directly provoked through his autocratic meddling. For months, he was a prisoner in a foreign city, engaged in some of the most desperate and dangerous fighting of his life. This was not warfare on the open plains of Gaul or Thessaly. This was brutal, street-to-street combat in a dense, hostile metropolis. Caesar's genius for improvisation was tested to its limits. He fortified the palace district, ordering his men to build walls and barricades. The Egyptians controlled the harbor and tried to cut off his access to the sea. There were naval battles fought within the great harbor itself. It was during one of these chaotic engagements that the famous Library of Alexandria may have been accidentally damaged. Seeking to destroy the Egyptian ships docked in the harbor, Caesar's men set them on fire. The flames, whipped by the wind, spread to the docks and warehouses near the library, and while it is unlikely the entire institution was destroyed, it is almost certain that a significant number of scrolls stored in a warehouse were lost, a tragic cultural casualty of Caesar's personal war. The fighting was savage. At one point, Caesar's position on the Pharos, the great lighthouse that controlled the entrance to the harbor, was overwhelmed. To escape, he was forced to leap from a causeway into the sea and swim for his life to a nearby ship, holding his important papers above the water with one hand, his purple general's cloak held in his teeth, as enemy arrows rained down around him. He was behaving less like a Roman consul and more like an epic hero from the pages of Homer, a king fighting a personal battle for his own survival and for the queen who was now his ally and lover. The war was a testament to his hubris. He had walked into a foreign dispute with a tiny force, supremely confident in his own ability to command fate, and had nearly been destroyed. His ultimate victory was only secured when relief forces summoned from Roman Asia and led by his ally Mithridates of Pergamum finally arrived and defeated the main Egyptian army. The young king, Ptolemy XIII, drowned in the Nile while trying to flee the battlefield, his golden armor weighing him down. With the war won and his enemy conveniently dead, Caesar's power over Egypt was absolute. He could have declared it a Roman province then and there, annexing its immense wealth directly for the state. This would have been the traditional republican course of action. But Caesar was no longer thinking like a traditional Roman. He was thinking like a Hellenistic monarch. He did not annex Egypt. Instead, he confirmed his client, Cleopatra, as the sole, independent ruler of the kingdom. To satisfy the appearance of tradition, he compelled her to marry her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. But this was a pure formality. Everyone knew who held the real power. Cleopatra was queen by the grace of Caesar. Her kingdom, while nominally independent, was now a personal possession of the Caesar dynasty. She was not a client of the Roman Senate and people. She was a client of Caesar. This was a new model of empire, one based not on republican administration, but on personal allegiance to an autocrat. He then embarked on a now legendary victory tour, a 2-month-long cruise down the Nile with Cleopatra on her magnificent royal barge. This was no simple holiday. It was a calculated political statement. As they traveled deep into the heart of ancient Egypt past the temples of the pharaohs, they presented themselves to the Egyptian people not as a Roman general and a client queen, but as a divine couple. Caesar was seen as the consort of the living goddess, Isis, which was one of Cleopatra's primary royal titles. For a Roman magistrate, this public dalliance with the trappings of Eastern divine monarchy was profoundly shocking. He was stepping outside the bounds of Roman identity and into the world of Alexander the Great and the god-kings of the East. And sometime during this period, the ultimate symbol of this new monarchical union was conceived. Cleopatra became pregnant with Caesar's child. This was not just a bastard born of a campaign affair. This was Caesarion, little Caesar, a son born to the master of Rome and the queen of Egypt. The existence of this child was the most tyrannical threat Caesar had yet posed to the Republic. The Roman fear of kingship was rooted in the fear of hereditary succession. Now, Caesar had an heir, a son who could one day claim a legacy that blended Roman power with the divine right of pharaohs. The spectre of a Romano-Egyptian dynasty ruling from Rome or Alexandria now haunted the Roman imagination. His idyll in Egypt was finally interrupted by news of trouble elsewhere. Pharnaces II, the son of the great Mithridates of Pontus whom Pompey had defeated years earlier, had taken advantage of the Roman civil war to try and reclaim his father's old kingdom in Asia Minor. He had defeated a local Roman force and was overrunning the region. Caesar, his work in Egypt done, finally departed. His journey to confront Pharnaces was swift, and his victory even swifter. At the Battle of Zela, in what is now modern-day Turkey, Caesar's veteran legions utterly crushed Pharnaces' army in a battle that lasted only 4 hours. It was after this almost contemptuously easy victory that Caesar sent back to Rome the most arrogant and famous military dispatch in history. It contained just 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The laconic brilliance of this statement cannot be overstated. It is the ultimate expression of tyrannical self-regard. This was not the sober, detailed report of a Republican proconsul to the Senate, listing casualties and acknowledging the efforts of his subordinates. This was the pronouncement of a god. The 3 alliterative, staccato words convey a sense of effortless, instantaneous, and total victory. The act of seeing is equated with the act of conquering. There is no struggle, no process, no acknowledgement of the role of fortune or the valor of his men. There is only the invincible, irresistible will of Caesar himself. The statement places him above the normal human condition. It was a message designed to awe, to intimidate, and to elevate him to a semi-divine status, far beyond that of a mere mortal magistrate. He returned to Rome, but his work was not yet done. The civil war still sputtered. While Caesar had been in Egypt, the surviving Pompeians and die-hard Republicans had regrouped. Their new stronghold was the Roman province of Africa, modern-day Tunisia, where they had gathered a massive army under the command of Metellus Scipio, Pompey's former father-in-law. They were supported by the powerful local client king, Juba of Numidia. More importantly, this was not just a military resistance, it was an ideological one. The heart and soul of this new Republican army was Caesar's most implacable and intellectually formidable enemy, Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Younger. Cato was more than a politician. He was a living embodiment of the old Roman virtues, a stoic philosopher who genuinely believed with every fiber of his being in the sanctity of the Republican Constitution. He saw Caesar not as a political rival, but as a disease, a plague that would destroy Roman liberty. He had refused to even speak to Caesar after Pharsalus, choosing instead to carry on the fight from Africa. For Cato and the men with him, this was not a struggle for power, it was a holy war for the soul of Rome. In late 47 BC, Caesar crossed into Africa to extinguish this final flame of Republican resistance. The campaign culminated in April of 46 BC at the Battle of Thapsus. The battle itself was a brutal, one-sided affair. The Republican army was large but unwieldy, and Caesar's veterans were simply superior soldiers. The battle reportedly began almost by accident, with Caesar's troops, eager for the fight, charging without his direct order. The result was a horrific slaughter. Unlike at Pharsalus, there was little clemency on the battlefield of Thapsus. Caesar's legions, enraged by the stubborn resistance of their fellow Romans, were said to have been uncontrollable, cutting down thousands of their surrendered countrymen in a frenzy of violence. Caesar had created an army of supremely effective killers who now, it seemed, even he could not always restrain. With the army destroyed, the cause was lost. Metellus Scipio tried to escape by sea but was intercepted and took his own life. King Juba did the same, but the final, most resonant act of defiance belonged to Cato. He had been in command of the city of Utica and had not been present at the battle. When news of the catastrophic defeat arrived, he knew that all was over. He calmly arranged for the evacuation of any senators who wished to flee, his composure a stark contrast to the panic around him. He then spent his final evening in philosophical discussion with his friends. He dined and then retired to his room to read Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, the Phaedo. He had a sword hidden in his room. In the dead of night, he threw himself upon it. His servants, hearing him fall, rushed in to find him grievously wounded. A physician was summoned, who stitched up the terrible gash in his abdomen. But Cato would not be saved. As soon as he was left alone, he regained consciousness, and with a grim and horrifying determination, he tore the stitches out with his bare hands and ripped his own wound open, pulling out his intestines and ensuring his death. Cato's suicide was not an act of despair. It was his final and greatest political statement. It was the ultimate stoic protest against a world he could no longer inhabit. He was choosing to die as a free man according to the laws of the Republic, rather than to live as a subject under the arbitrary mercy of a tyrant. He knew that Caesar would have made a great show of pardoning him. He would have been the crown jewel in Caesar's collection of pardoned enemies. By taking his own life, Cato denied Caesar this ultimate victory. He robbed the tyrant of the chance to display his clementia over the very soul of the Republic. When Caesar finally arrived in Utica and learned of how Cato had died, his reaction was one of pure frustration. "Cato," he lamented, "I grudge you your death as you would have grudged me the chance of sparing your life." In that single, honest expression of thwarted ambition, Caesar revealed the true nature of his mercy. It was never about reconciliation, it was about domination. Cato had understood this perfectly. He had chosen death over the humiliation of being spared by the man who had murdered his country. With Cato's death, the intellectual and spiritual resistance to Caesar's tyranny was broken. The man who lived by the old laws was gone, leaving only the man who had become the law himself. With Cato's defiant death in Utica, the ideological war was over. The Republic, as a living principle in the hearts of its most ardent defenders, was dead. What remained was the consolidation of power. When Gaius Julius Caesar returned to Rome in the autumn of 46 BC, he returned not as a conquering proconsul making his report to the Senate, but as an undisputed master coming home to claim his property. The city he now entered was his to remake, and the ceremonies designed to welcome him were not the traditional honors of a republic, but the first coronation rituals of a new monarchy, disguised under a thin veneer of republican language. The tyranny was no longer a creeping shadow. It was about to be carved in marble, celebrated in the streets, and deified in the temples. The next phase of his rule would be a masterclass in autocratic stagecraft, the systematic transformation of a citizen into a living god. The most visible and overwhelming display of this new reality was Caesar's quadruple triumph. The Roman triumph was the highest honor a general could receive, a grand military parade through the city, culminating in a sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. It was a semi-sacred rite, governed by strict religious and legal protocols. Crucially, a triumph could only be celebrated for a victory over a foreign enemy. To celebrate a triumph over fellow Roman citizens was unthinkable, a grotesque perversion of the rite that would mean gloating over the death of one's own countrymen. Caesar, a genius of propaganda, found a way to bend this sacred rule to his will. He staged not one, but 4 separate triumphs, held on different days, spaced out over the course of a month. Each was ostensibly for a foreign victory, a carefully constructed fiction to mask the raw reality of civil war. The first triumph was for Gaul. This was his one legitimate claim, a spectacular procession that showcased the immense wealth and exotic peoples he had conquered. Chariots laden with captured gold and silver, massive painted billboards depicting key battles, and long lines of chained Gallic chieftains, including the noble Vercingetorix, who had been kept imprisoned in a Roman dungeon for 6 years specifically for this moment, were paraded through the streets. Vercingetorix was the tragic centerpiece of the show. After being displayed to the Roman crowds as the ultimate symbol of Caesar's victory, he was taken to the Tullianum, the state prison at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, and ritually strangled. His death was a stark and brutal reminder of the fate of those who resisted Caesar's will. The immense scale of the Gallic plunder was put on full display, a tangible demonstration to the people of Rome of the profits his conquests had brought them. The second triumph was for Egypt. This was a more delicate matter. He could not celebrate a victory over Ptolemy XIII, as Rome had not been formally at war with Egypt. Instead, it was presented as a victory over the treacherous courtier Pothinus and the forces that had defied a Roman consul. The procession featured exotic animals, representations of the Nile, and a depiction of the pharaoh's lighthouse. The star attraction was Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe, who was forced to walk in the parade in chains. Her youth and royal dignity, however, evoked such pity from the Roman crowd that it created a public relations backlash, a rare misstep for Caesar. He was forced to spare her life and send her into exile, rather than executing her as planned. The underlying message of the Egyptian triumph, however, was clear. Caesar had tamed the ancient and wealthy kingdom of the East and made its queen his client. The third triumph was for his victory over Pharnaces of Pontus. This was presented as a swift, clean victory over an upstart foreign king, allowing Caesar to once again highlight his famous Veni, Vidi, Vici dispatch, which was emblazoned on a large banner for all to see. It reinforced the image of Caesar as a man of almost supernatural speed and efficiency. But it was the fourth triumph, the one for his victory in Africa, that was the most audacious and cynical deception. He could not, of course, celebrate a triumph over Cato and Metellus Scipio as they were Roman senators. So he claimed the triumph was for his victory over King Juba of Numidia, the local African ruler who had allied with the Republicans. This was a transparent fiction. Everyone knew that the war in Africa had been fought to extinguish the last remnants of the Pompeian faction. The parade featured captured Numidian arms and the young son of King Juba as a captive. But the true, unspoken victory being celebrated was the final destruction of the Roman Republic's armies. The four triumphs, taken together, were an overwhelming sensory assault, a month-long festival of autocracy that hammered home a single point. Caesar had conquered the entire known world, both foreign and domestic, and all its wealth now flowed through him. The public celebrations that followed were on a scale never before seen. Caesar used his vast personal fortune, plundered from Gaul and the treasuries of the East, to fund lavish games and public banquets, a colossal exercise in popular bribery. He hosted a feast for the entire population of Rome, with 22,000 dining tables set up in the streets. He gave massive cash bonuses not only to his soldiers but to every citizen. He staged spectacular and brutal gladiatorial games, wild beast hunts in the Circus Maximus featuring giraffes and other exotic creatures never before seen in Rome, and even a full-scale mock naval battle, a naumachia for which a special basin was excavated near the Tiber, large enough to hold 2 fleets of real warships manned by thousands of condemned prisoners who fought to the death. These spectacles were more than just entertainment. They were a demonstration of a power that transcended that of a normal magistrate. Only a king, a monarch with the resources of the entire world at his command, could offer such gifts. He was conditioning the Roman people to see him not as their elected official, but as their supreme benefactor, their provider, the source of all good things. He was replacing the concept of the state as the provider with the concept of Caesar as the provider. With the population pacified by bread and circuses, Caesar turned his attention to the formal instruments of power. The Senate, now packed with his own hand-picked supporters, many of them obscure men from the Italian countryside or even soldiers and sons of freedmen from Gaul, became little more than a rubber stamp for his will. They competed with each other to shower him with the most elaborate and unprecedented honors. He was named dictator not for the traditional 6 months, but for a period of 10 years. This was a fundamental break with Republican tradition, destroying the principle of annuality that was designed to prevent any one man from holding power for too long. He was also granted the title Praefectus Morum, Prefect of the Morals, an office that combined the powers of the old Roman censor, giving him the authority to supervise public morality and, crucially, to control the membership of the Senate, purging his enemies and appointing his friends. He was given the right to speak first in any Senate debate, effectively setting the agenda for all business. He was given control over all armies and treasuries of the state. His statue was to be placed in the temple of Quirinus, one of Rome's deified founders, with the inscription, "To the Invincible God." Other statues of him were erected on the Capitoline Hill alongside those of the 7 ancient kings of Rome and that of Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had overthrown the kings. The irony was savage and deliberate. Caesar was placing himself as the 8th king, the culmination of all Roman history. He was granted a permanent military escort, a bodyguard of senators and equestrians. The month of the year in which he was born, Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor, modern-day July. His birthday was made a public holiday. He was, in effect, being made a living god, a monarch in all but name. And yet, there was still one final pocket of military resistance. The two sons of Pompey, Gnaeus and Sextus, had escaped from Africa and made their way to Spain, the province where their father's name still held immense power. There, they rallied the remnants of the Republican forces, the survivors of Thapsus, and local tribes resentful of Caesar's rule. They raised a large army and posed a serious enough threat that Caesar was forced to leave Rome once again to deal with them personally. This final campaign was, by Caesar's own admission, the hardest and most desperate of his life. The enemy he faced in Spain was no longer composed of reluctant Pompeians or foreign levies. It was an army of men who knew they had no hope of pardon, men who had been defeated and pardoned once before and had chosen to fight again. They fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. The final battle took place at Munda, in southern Spain, in March of 45 BC. The Battle of Munda was a bloodbath. Caesar's legions, for a moment, were on the verge of breaking. The fighting was so close and so brutal that Caesar himself was forced to dismount and fight in the front ranks as a common soldier to rally his men. He would later tell his friends that he had often fought for victory, but at Munda he had fought for his life. In the end, the discipline of his veterans held. The Pompeian army was shattered, and this time there was no clemency. An estimated 30,000 men were killed on the Republican side. Gnaeus Pompey was hunted down and killed. Only Sextus Pompey managed to escape, destined to become a pirate king who would plague the inheritors of Caesar's power for years to come. When Caesar returned to Rome after Munda, a fundamental shift occurred. He celebrated another triumph, but this time he dropped all pretense. It was not a triumph for a victory over a foreign ally of his opponents. It was an open, unambiguous triumph for his victory at Munda, a victory over the sons of Pompey the Great and their Roman legions. The citizens of Rome watched in stunned silence as a Roman general paraded through their streets, celebrating the slaughter of his own countrymen. The fiction that had cloaked his previous triumphs was gone. This was a naked display of power, a declaration that the old rules, the old pieties, no longer applied. He was celebrating the death of the Republic itself and forcing the city to celebrate with him. It was a terrifying moment of clarity for many who had been willing to look the other way. Now, with all military opposition crushed, Caesar's autocracy became absolute and undisguised. The Senate, in a final act of sycophantic self-destruction, voted to make him dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This was the final, fatal step. The office of dictator was now permanent, hereditary in all but name. The title severed the last thin thread connecting his power to republican tradition. A 10-year dictatorship was an aberration. A perpetual dictatorship was a monarchy. He was granted the right to hold any magistracy he wished, to appoint half of all the magistrates each year, and to control all foreign policy. The state was now his personal property. He began to treat the institutions of the republic with an open and growing contempt. He would receive senators while sitting on his throne without rising to greet them, a profound insult in Roman culture. On one occasion, when the entire Senate came to him to confer yet another list of honors, he received them in front of the temple of Venus Genetrix, the temple he had built to his own divine ancestress, and did not stand. He once famously remarked that the Republic is nothing, a mere name without body or form. His public image began to take on explicitly divine and monarchical characteristics. He was the first living Roman to have his own portrait appear on the state coinage, a privilege previously reserved for gods and long-dead heroes. His coins depicted him wearing the laurel wreath, an ancient symbol of victory and divinity, which he now wore constantly, perhaps also to conceal his baldness. He accepted the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland, a title of immense honor that placed him as the patriarchal, king-like figure of the entire Roman family. He established a new priesthood, the Luperci Julii, dedicated to the cult of his own genius, his indwelling spirit. He planned vast, transformative building projects for the city of Rome, projects that would stamp his name on the physical landscape for all eternity, just as Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic kings had done in their own capitals. The central question, the one that hung in the air of every Senate meeting and was whispered in the corridors of every noble house, was no longer whether Caesar was a king, but whether he would take the formal title. The word rex was still a curse, the ultimate taboo, but Caesar seemed to be deliberately testing the boundaries, teasing the public with the possibility. The most famous of these tests occurred at the festival of the Lupercalia in February of 44 BC. Caesar was seated on his golden throne in the Forum, watching the ancient fertility rite. His loyal lieutenant, Mark Antony, who was serving as consul, ran into the Forum, and in a piece of carefully staged political theatre, he approached Caesar and tried to place a royal diadem, the narrow white ribbon that was the symbol of Hellenistic monarchy, on his head. Caesar, playing his part, refused it. The crowd, carefully coached, applauded his refusal. Antony tried again. Caesar refused again, to even greater applause. Finally, Caesar ordered that the diadem be taken to the temple of Jupiter, declaring that Jupiter alone was the king of the Romans. The meaning of this public drama was ambiguous. Was it a genuine rejection of the title, a sign that Caesar understood the limits of Roman tolerance? Or was it a cynical piece of theatre designed to gauge public opinion, a test balloon that had failed to fly? For a growing number of senators, the answer was clear. The Lupercalia incident was not a rejection of kingship, but the final confirmation of Caesar's monarchical ambition. He had not just refused a crown, he had been publicly offered one by a Roman consul. The taboo had been broken. The possibility was now out in the open. They believed that he was simply waiting for a more opportune moment. Perhaps after his planned massive new war against the Parthian Empire, from which he would return as a world-conquering hero, to formally accept the title. For these men, the conspirators who were now beginning to coalesce in secret, the choice was becoming stark. They could continue to live as subjects under the ever-expanding power of a de facto king, or they could act. They could reenact the foundational myth of their republic. They could follow in the footsteps of their ancestor, Lucius Junius Brutus, and kill the tyrant to make Rome free again. The stage was being set for the final act of Caesar's life, an act that would take place not on a foreign battlefield, but in the heart of Rome itself. The Ides of March, the 15th day of the 3rd month. Before 44 BC, the date was an ordinary one, a simple marker in the Roman calendar for settling debts. After 44 BC, it would become the most resonant and chilling date in the annals of political assassination, a day synonymous with conspiracy, betrayal, and the bloody collision of tyranny and liberty. The conspiracy against Gaius Julius Caesar was not the work of a few bitter malcontents or desperate Pompeians. It was a large and ideologically diverse coalition, numbering more than 60 senators. It included men who had fought against him and been pardoned, like Marcus Junius Brutus, and men who had been his own loyal officers and staunchest supporters, like Gaius Trebonius and Decimus Junius Brutus. Their decision to kill him was not born of a single grievance, but from a cumulative, suffocating certainty that the man who had been made a perpetual dictator was now an incurable disease in the body politic. The very fabric of the Republic was dissolving under the acid of his absolute power, and they believed that only the most extreme surgery, the cutting out of the tyrant himself, could save it. The final omens and portents that ancient historians so lovingly attach to the story are, in themselves, a testament to the sheer, world-altering gravity of what was about to happen. The sacred horses Caesar had dedicated after crossing the Rubicon were said to have refused to graze, weeping copious tears. A wren, flying into the Curia of Pompeii with a laurel sprig in its beak, was said to have been torn to pieces by other birds. Spurinna, a famous soothsayer, had examined a sacrifice and had explicitly warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His own wife, Calpurnia, plagued by nightmares of his murder, begged him not to attend the Senate meeting scheduled for that day. Caesar himself, a man who had built a career on defying superstition and bending fortune to his will, was reportedly hesitant. He considered staying home, but the conspirators were ready. One of them, Decimus Junius Brutus, a man Caesar trusted so implicitly that he had named him as a secondary heir in his will, was sent to his house. Decimus gently mocked Caesar for paying heed to a woman's dreams and the ramblings of soothsayers. He shamed him, appealing to his sense of duty and his public image, reminding him that the entire Senate was assembled and waiting to honor him. Caesar, his pride pricked, relented. He decided to go. On his way to the meeting, a man named Artemidorus reportedly tried to hand him a scroll explicitly detailing the conspiracy, urging him to read it alone and at once. But in the crush of petitioners and flatterers, Caesar was unable to read the note and simply handed it to an attendant. The final warning went unheeded. As he entered the building where the Senate was meeting, he is said to have seen the soothsayer Spurina in the crowd and remarked, with a touch of smugness, "The Ides of March have come." Spurina's famous, chilling reply was, "Aye, Caesar, but not yet gone." The Senate was not meeting in its usual house, the Curia Hostilia in the Roman Forum, which was being rebuilt after a fire. The meeting place for that day was a hall within the larger complex of the Theatre of Pompey, the magnificent structure built by Caesar's great rival. The irony was thick and inescapable. Caesar would be struck down in a building commissioned by, and at the foot of a statue of, the very man he had vanquished to achieve his absolute power. The conspirators had planned their attack with military precision. They had arranged for a group of gladiators owned by Decimus Brutus to be on hand in the theatre below, ready to be called upon if the assassination went wrong and they needed armed support. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal co-consul and a man of formidable physical strength, was deliberately waylaid outside the chamber by Gaius Trebonius, who engaged him in a long conversation to prevent him from coming to Caesar's aid. As Caesar took his seat on his gilded throne, the conspirators surrounded him, pretending to be petitioners. One of them, Tilius Cimber, approached with a plea to recall his exiled brother. This was the pre-arranged signal. As Cimber made his appeal, he knelt and then grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it down from his neck. This was not just a signal for the attack to begin. It was a symbolic act of stripping the magistrate of his official garments, reducing him to a mere man. Caesar, annoyed, cried out, "Why? This is violence!" At that moment, another of the conspirators, Publius Servilius Casca, who was standing behind him, drew his dagger and lunged, aiming for the neck. But in his nervousness, his hand trembled and the blade only grazed Caesar's shoulder, leaving a shallow wound. Caesar, a veteran of countless battles, reacted instantly. He sprang to his feet, a cornered animal, and his instincts as a soldier took over. He impaled Casca's arm with his stylus, the sharp metal pen he used for writing on wax tablets. "Vile Casca! What are you doing?" he roared. Casca screamed for help from his brother, and in an instant, the entire group of 60 men descended upon the single, unarmed dictator. What followed was not a clean, swift execution. It was a frenzied, chaotic butchery. The senators, many of whom were not soldiers and were clumsy with their weapons, stabbed wildly, fueled by a mixture of terror, ideological fervor, and adrenaline. They were so frantic that in the bloody confusion, many of them wounded each other. They were like a pack of wolves, each one needing to sink his teeth into the kill to be a part of the act of liberation. Caesar fought back with ferocious strength, twisting and turning, trying to fend off the blows. But he was hopelessly outnumbered. He was stabbed from every direction. The scene was one of grim, almost ritualistic slaughter, each man driving his dagger into the tyrant's body, ensuring they were all equally complicit, equally bound by the blood they had spilled. And then came the most famous and debated moment of the entire affair. According to the historian Suetonius, as Caesar fought for his life, he saw among the faces of his attackers the face of Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was not just a pardoned enemy. He was the son of Caesar's longtime mistress, Servilia. Caesar had known him his entire life, had treated him with immense favor, had promoted his career, and had genuinely seemed to hold him in high affection. In Roman gossip, it was even whispered that Brutus might have been Caesar's illegitimate son. Seeing this beloved, almost filial figure among his murderers seemed to finally break his will to fight. He looked at Brutus and uttered his final, heartbroken words. The Latin version, as given by Suetonius, is tu quoque, Brute, fili me. You too, Brutus, my son. The more famous Greek version, reported by other sources, is kai su teknon, you too, my child. With that final expression of shocked betrayal, he gave up the struggle. He pulled his toga up over his head, covering his face so that no man would see him die, and collapsed at the base of the great statue of his fallen rival, Pompey. There, he bled to death from 23 stab wounds, his lifeblood pooling on the floor of the Senate house, staining the marble pedestal of his vanquished enemy. The great Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the victor of a world war, the man who had been declared a living god, lay dead on a cold stone floor, slain not by a foreign army, but by the very senators who were supposed to be his colleagues. The immediate aftermath of the assassination was not the joyous liberation the conspirators had envisioned. It was chaos and terror. The other senators present, who were not part of the plot, fled the chamber in panic, screaming and stumbling over each other, convinced they were all about to be massacred. The city of Rome, upon hearing the news, did not erupt in cheers for its newfound liberty. It fell into a stunned, terrified silence. People barricaded themselves in their homes, unsure of what was happening, who was in charge, or whether a new round of proscriptions and civil war was about to begin. The liberators, as they styled themselves, had made a fatal miscalculation. They had a detailed plan to kill the tyrant, but they had no concrete plan for what to do next. They seem to have naively believed that with the tyrant's body lying cold, the Republic would magically spring back to life, that the old institutions would simply start working again. They had forgotten that Caesar had not just been a man, he had been the entire government. He had been the provider, the benefactor, the source of all authority. His death did not restore the Republic, it created a catastrophic power vacuum. Brutus and the other leading conspirators marched from the scene of the murder to the Capitoline Hill, the ancient citadel of Rome, holding their bloody daggers aloft and shouting that the people of Rome were free once more. But the people did not join them. The streets were eerily empty. In the ensuing days, two key figures emerged from the chaos, two men who would become the accidental inheritors of Caesar's legacy. The first was Mark Antony. He had been Caesar's co-consul, his most trusted general, and now, as the sole surviving consul, he was the highest-ranking legal official in the state. After an initial moment of fear, he seized the initiative. He secured Caesar's official papers and, more importantly, his last will and testament. He negotiated a tense truce with the conspirators, agreeing to an amnesty for the murder in exchange for the Senate's ratification of all of Caesar's planned acts and appointments. This was a brilliant move. It avoided an immediate civil war, but it also ensured that the vast network of Caesarian patronage remained intact. The second, and far more significant figure, was a complete unknown. He was a frail, studious, and ruthlessly ambitious 19-year-old named Gaius Octavius. He was Caesar's grandnephew, the grandson of his sister Julia. He had been away in Greece, completing his military and rhetorical education, when he received the news of Caesar's murder. He soon learned something even more shocking. In his will, Caesar had formally adopted this young man as his son and had made him the principal heir to his name and his immense fortune. Overnight, the obscure teenager Gaius Octavius ceased to exist. He was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or as we know him, Octavian. He immediately sailed for Italy to claim his inheritance, a decision that his family, fearing for his life, begged him not to make. But Octavian, though young, possessed a political cunning and a cold reptilian determination that would ultimately dwarf that of every other player on the stage. He understood, with a clarity that even Antony lacked, that his greatest asset was not the money, but the name. The name Caesar was a source of immense power, a magical word that commanded the loyalty of the legions and the love of the common people. The breaking point, the moment that turned the tense political truce into an unquenchable fire, was Caesar's funeral. Brutus, in what would prove to be another catastrophic error of judgment, gave Mark Antony permission to deliver the eulogy. In the Roman Forum, before a vast, grieving crowd, Antony put on the performance of his life. He began soberly, reading from Caesar's will. He revealed to the public Caesar's extraordinary generosity. He had bequeathed his vast gardens by the Tiber to the people of Rome as a public park. And more importantly, he had left a gift of 300 sesterces to every single Roman citizen. This news, a final act of paternal benevolence from their murdered benefactor, began to turn the crowd's mood from sorrow to anger. Then Antony unveiled his masterstroke. He produced the blood-soaked, torn toga that Caesar had been wearing when he was killed. He held it up for all to see, pointing out the rips and tears made by the daggers, naming the conspirators who had made each one. He walked down from the speaker's platform and dramatically pulled back the shroud covering Caesar's body, which had been laid out on an ivory bier, revealing a wax effigy showing all 23 of the gruesome wounds. The effect was electric. The crowd, which had been sullen and fearful, erupted into a tidal wave of hysterical grief and rage. They saw not the death of a tyrant, but the martyrdom of a god, the butchering of the father of their country. The carefully planned liberation was instantly reframed as a monstrous act of patricide, committed by a cabal of ungrateful, elitist aristocrats. The mob surged through the forum in a frenzy, creating a makeshift funeral pyre for Caesar's body out of the benches and tables from the surrounding law courts. The sacred flame consumed the body of the man who had remade Rome, but the fire did not stop there. The enraged mob, brandishing torches plucked from the pyre, hunted through the city for the assassins. They mistook a hapless tribune named Helvius Cinna for one of the conspirators, Cornelius Cinna, and tore him limb from limb in the street. The liberators, their dream of a restored republic turning into a nightmare, were forced to flee the city for their lives. Caesar's body was gone, but his ghost now haunted Rome, and it was a ghost that demanded vengeance. In the ensuing power struggle, the two main inheritors of his legacy, the seasoned general Mark Antony and the cunning young upstart Octavian, would first clash and then form a new, even more monstrous triumvirate with another of Caesar's former generals, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. This second triumvirate was not a secret pact like the first. It was a formal, legalized 5-year dictatorship for 3 men whose stated purpose was to hunt down and destroy Caesar's assassins. They unleashed a new wave of proscriptions, far more brutal and systematic than Sulla's. Their primary target was not just the conspirators, but anyone with wealth they could confiscate to pay their vast armies. The great orator Cicero, who had celebrated Caesar's death as a just act of tyrannicide, was one of their first victims. His head and his hands, the hands that had written the speeches condemning Antony, were cut off and nailed to the rostra in the Forum, a gruesome warning to any who dared to speak against the new regime. The final act of the tragedy played out, fittingly, in Greece. At the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, the combined armies of Antony and Octavian met the forces of the last republicans, Brutus and Cassius. In 2 brutal battles, the armies of the liberators were crushed. Cassius, wrongly believing the battle was lost, had his slave kill him. Brutus, his army defeated and his cause in ruins, also took his own life, running on his own sword. With his death, the last breath of the Roman Republic was extinguished on a foreign battlefield. The dream of liberty was dead, but the story does not end there. Caesar's ghost was not yet sated. The victorious triumvirs soon fell to quarreling amongst themselves. The next decade would see another round of civil wars, this time between Caesar's own heirs. It would culminate in the final, epic confrontation between Mark Antony, now allied with his lover, the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, and the cold, calculating Octavian. At the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. They fled back to Egypt, where they both committed suicide, leaving Octavian as the sole, undisputed master of the entire Roman world. And what did Octavian do with this absolute power? He learned the ultimate lesson from his great-uncle's death. He understood that the Romans might accept the reality of monarchy, but they would never accept the name. So he created a new system, a brilliant, subtle fiction known as the Principate. He restored the Republic. He held elections. He consulted the Senate. He respected the old forms and titles. But it was a hollow shell. He retained ultimate control of the most important provinces and all the major legions. He was granted a collection of powers that made him an emperor in all but name. He took the unassuming title of princeps, first citizen, and a new, hallowed name voted to him by the Senate, Augustus. The age of the Roman emperors had begun. The tyranny of Julius Caesar was not an aberration that was ended by his death. It was a catalyst. His murder did not save the Republic. It guaranteed its destruction and accelerated the birth of the very system of autocratic rule that the conspirators had killed him to prevent. He had torn down the old structures so completely that there was nothing left to go back to. In the end, Caesar won. He had created a world where the only alternative to his own brand of tyranny was an even more efficient and permanent one, built by the heir who bore his name. His ultimate legacy was not the end of the Republic, but the creation of the template for every emperor who would follow. And so the Republic died. It was not slain in a single clean blow on the Ides of March, for it had been bleeding out for a century. But its final, gasping breath was taken on the plains of Philippi, where the last men who called themselves liberators ran on their own swords. The death of Brutus was the death of an idea, the end of a dream that had lasted 500 years. What followed was not a restoration, but a reckoning. The victors, Caesar's heirs, turned on each other in a final world-spanning civil war that culminated in one man, Caesar's adopted son, standing alone amidst the wreckage. Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was the ultimate victor. But the path he walked, the throne he built, the very world he inherited, all of it was surveyed, cleared, and paved by the man whose name he took as his own. To understand the full measure of Caesar's tyranny, we must look beyond his own life and death. His true legacy was not a list of battles won or laws passed. His legacy was the vacancy he created, the imperial throne itself. He was a tyrant not just because of what he did, but because of what he made possible and what he made impossible. He made a return to the Republic impossible. The great defense of Caesar, the one that has echoed through the centuries and still holds a powerful sway, is the argument from necessity. The Republic, his defenders claim, was already a corpse. It was a hopelessly corrupt, dysfunctional, and oligarchic system, choked by its own internal contradictions. It was incapable of governing the vast empire it had acquired. The staggering inequality, the armies of dispossessed farmers, the gridlock in the Senate, the endemic violence of street gangs. These were the symptoms of a terminal disease. Caesar, in this view, was not the murderer of the Republic. He was the pragmatic physician who, seeing the patient was beyond saving, acted decisively to put it out of its misery and birth something new, something more stable and efficient in its place. He was a great man, a genius, who saw that the old system was broken and had the courage and vision to replace it. His autocracy was not tyranny. It was a necessary and even benevolent evolution. This argument is a powerful one, but it is also a profoundly dangerous justification for the seizure of absolute power. It is the perennial excuse of the autocrat, and it deliberately ignores the central charge. The question is not whether the late Republic was sick. It undoubtedly was. The question is whether Caesar was the cure, or whether he was the most virulent symptom of the disease itself. His contemporary opponents, men like Cicero and Cato, saw the same sickness. But their proposed remedies, however flawed or idealistic, were to try and reform the system, to call it back to its first principles of shared governance and the rule of law. Caesar's remedy was to abolish the system and replace it with himself. He did not seek to heal the diseased organs of the state. He sought to amputate them and graft his own will in their place. He saw the gridlock created by the Constitution's checks and balances not as a feature to be respected, but as an obstacle to be smashed. His entire career was a systematic assault on the very mechanisms designed to prevent the rise of a king. When his consular colleague Bibulus attempted to use the legal and religious tools of the state to oppose his legislation, Caesar did not outmaneuver him within the system. He used mob violence to drive him from the forum, rendering the principle of collegiality a joke. When the Senate, the central deliberative body of the state, refused to grant him his demands, he did not negotiate. He bypassed it entirely, taking his laws directly to the popular assemblies, backed by the implicit threat of his soldiers' fists. And when the law of the Republic finally demanded that he lay down his arms and return to Rome as a private citizen to be held accountable for his actions, he did not submit to the judgment of his peers. He crossed the Rubicon and declared war on the state. At every single turn, when faced with a choice between the law and his own ambition, he chose his ambition. He was not a reformer, he was a revolutionary who sought to tear down the entire edifice so that he could stand alone on the rubble. His celebrated reforms, when viewed through this lens, cease to look like selfless acts of statesmanship and instead reveal themselves as finely honed instruments of personal power. His reform of the calendar, for instance, was a necessary and brilliant scientific achievement, but it was also an act of supreme monarchical arrogance. He literally stamped his own name, July, onto the eternal procession of the seasons, forever associating the very measurement of time with his personal authority. When he passed laws to alleviate debt, it was not merely to address economic hardship. It was a populist masterstroke that bound thousands of indebted citizens and ambitious aristocrats directly to him as their personal savior, weakening their ties to traditional patrons and institutions. His expansion of Roman citizenship to peoples in the provinces, particularly in his former command of Cisalpine Gaul, was a progressive measure, but it also served to create legions of new citizens whose primary loyalty was not to the old Senate in Rome, but to the man who had enfranchised them, Gaius Julius Caesar. Every act of apparent generosity was also an act of consolidation. Even his much vaunted efficiency in provincial administration, his crackdown on the extortionate practices of the tax farmers and governors who had bled the provinces dry, was double-edged. Yes, it may have improved the lives of some provincials, but it also served to rationalize the system of imperial extraction, making it a more efficient machine for funneling the wealth of the world not into the public treasury of a commonwealth, but into the coffers of an autocrat and his followers. He replaced the chaotic, often brutal, but decentralized looting of the provinces by competing republican nobles with a centralized, systematic, and far more effective system of control that benefited him alone. In every policy, the ultimate goal was the enhancement of his own power, his own dignitas, his own control. Nowhere is the tyrannical nature of his rule more subtly and profoundly revealed than in his famous policy of clementia. His clemency was the antithesis of justice. Justice is impartial. It is administered according to a known set of laws by legitimate institutions and applies to all equally. Caesar's mercy was personal, arbitrary, and transactional. It was a gift bestowed from a superior to an inferior. By pardoning his captured Roman enemies, he was performing a terrifying act of political alchemy. He was transmuting a fellow citizen, a political equal under the law of the Republic, into a dependent, a subject whose very life was now a gift from Caesar. To accept the pardon was to acknowledge his authority to grant it, to accept his judgment as superior to that of the state. It was to become his client in the most profound way imaginable, bound by an obligation that erased all previous loyalties. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing a century later under the Emperor Nero, would analyze this very dynamic in his treatise On Mercy. Seneca understood that the power to grant mercy, when held by an absolute ruler, is the most complete expression of his power. It is the power over life and death, wielded not by the law, but by personal whim. The man who can pardon can also condemn. His mercy is not a sign of a gentle nature, it is a constant, implicit reminder of his absolute and terrifying power. Cato the Younger understood this with perfect, soul-searing clarity. His suicide at Utica was the ultimate philosophical rejection of Caesar's clemency. He refused to be a character in Caesar's drama of magnanimity. He refused to allow his life to become a gift from the man who had destroyed his country. He chose the self-determination of death over the subjugation of a pardon. He knew that to live by Caesar's grace was to accept the death of the free republic and the legitimacy of the tyrant. Caesar's frustrated lament, "I grudge you your death as you would have grudged me the chance of sparing your life," is the most honest and revealing statement he ever made. It shows that his mercy was not for the benefit of the pardoned, but for the aggrandizement of the pardoner. It was the ultimate tool for asserting his monarchical status. And it was this status, a status that transcended mere politics, that was Caesar's ultimate goal. The final and most profound aspect of his tyranny was his assault on the religious and spiritual foundations of the Roman state. A Roman magistrate was a servant of the state, but he was also a servant of the gods. His authority was contingent upon divine approval, determined through augury and sacrifice. He was a mortal man, temporarily entrusted with power. Caesar systematically dismantled this worldview and sought to replace it with a cult of his own personality. He did not just want to be a king, he wanted to be a god. The unprecedented honors he accepted were all steps on this path to deification. Having his statue placed in the temples, alongside those of the gods themselves, was an act of profound sacrilege. Having a priesthood, the Luperci Julii, dedicated to the worship of his personal genius, his guiding spirit, was to claim that his own soul was a divine entity worthy of public worship. Being the first living Roman to place his own portrait on the coinage was to usurp an honor reserved for the divine and to turn a tool of the state's economy into a medium for his personal propaganda, disseminating his image to every corner of the empire. When he built the magnificent temple of Venus Genetrix in his new forum, he was not just honoring a goddess, he was advertising his own divine lineage, reminding the world that the Julian clan claimed direct descent from the goddess of love herself. His perpetual dictatorship, his title of Father of the Fatherland, his renaming of a month in his honor, all these things worked together to elevate him beyond the category of citizen and into the category of founder, patriarch, and deity. He was no longer just a magistrate of the Roman people, he was becoming the patron god of the Roman state. This was the ultimate tyrannical ambition. It was to collapse the entire cosmic order, the state, the law, the heavens themselves, into his own person. He sought to become the single source of all power, all law, all honor, and all divinity. This was a vision of power so absolute that it was fundamentally incompatible with any aspect of the republican ideal. A republic is a government of laws, not of men. Caesar's goal was to become the living law. In the end, this is the core of the argument. Julius Caesar was a tyrant, not because he was cruel. He was often magnanimous. He was a tyrant not because he was incompetent. He was a genius of terrifying ability. He was a tyrant because he, a single citizen, deliberately and systematically dismantled every legal, political, and religious safeguard that the Roman people had erected over 5 centuries to prevent the return of a king, and he did it for the sake of his own personal power and glory. He found a republic of laws and tried to transform it into a monarchy of one man. He inherited a system where power was a public trust, and he treated it as his private property. His murder on the Ides of March was a tragic, brutal, and ultimately futile act. The conspirators who struck him down were not wrong to see him as a tyrant. Their catastrophic mistake was to believe that by killing the man, they could kill the system he had created. They failed to understand that the republic they had killed him to save was already dead, and he had been the one to kill it. The power vacuum he left behind could not be filled by the old, broken institutions. It could only be filled by another autocrat. The civil wars that followed his death were merely the bloody succession crisis of a new monarchy. When his adopted son, Octavian, finally emerged as the sole ruler and, with cynical brilliance, cloaked his absolute power in the language of the restored republic, he was completing Caesar's work, not undoing it. The Principate of Augustus was the perfected, institutionalized form of the tyranny that Caesar had pioneered. So we are left with the ghost of Caesar, a figure who looms over Western history as a man of immense and troubling contradictions. He was a populist who destroyed a popular government. He was a conqueror who conquered his own country. He was a lawgiver who placed himself above the law. He was a bringer of a certain kind of order, but the price of that order was liberty. The ultimate judgment on his tyranny lies in the world he created. He burned down the old house of the Republic with all its messy, chaotic, and often unjust rooms, but also with its open doors and windows. In its place, he laid the foundations for a magnificent, orderly, and enduring imperial palace, a structure that would stand for centuries. But it was a palace with only one master, a gilded cage. He proved that a republic, if it becomes too weak, too corrupt, or too unequal, is fatally vulnerable to the ambitions of a great man. He provided the timeless and terrifying blueprint for how a free state can be brought to its knees, not always by foreign enemies, but by one of its own. That is his legacy, and that is why, to those who held the old ideals dear, he was, and would forever remain, a tyrant. And so the world that followed was not the Republic reborn, but Caesar's vision perfected by a colder, more patient hand. The system that Augustus built, the one we call the Roman Empire, was the great and terrible monument to Caesar's life and death. It was a masterpiece of political fiction, an autocracy wrapped in the sacred shroud of the Republic, a monarchy that dared not speak its name, a tyranny so successful and so stable that it would endure for centuries. The conspirators on the Ides of March, in their desperate and bloody idealism, had hoped to cut out the king and save the state, but they had only managed to kill the man while making his spirit immortal, unleashing it upon the world. The ghost of Caesar, a spectre of absolute power and popular acclaim, would rule Rome long after his own body had turned to ash and mingled with the soil of the Forum. His very name, Caesar, detached itself from the man of flesh and blood and became something else entirely. It became a title, an idea, an echo of absolute power that would be whispered in the gilded throne rooms of German Kaisers and Russian Tsars for 2,000 years. And with that enduring echo, the great debate over his legacy has never ceased, a civil war of ideas that is still fought in the halls of academia and the quiet studies of historians. Was he the physician the dying republic needed, a political surgeon with the courage to amputate the gangrenous limbs of a corrupt oligarchy? Or was he the disease itself, a brilliant and charismatic plague that promised a cure but delivered only a more elegant death? Was he a builder who, seeing the foundations of a failed state crumbling, had the vision to clear the rubble and erect a lasting peace? Or was he a master demolitions expert who blew up a free government for no other reason than his own glorification, so that he could be the tallest thing left standing? History, it seems, has never quite managed to render a final verdict, because the figure of Caesar acts as a mirror. What we see in him often reflects the deepest anxieties and aspirations of our own time. The argument from necessity, the defense of Caesar as a great historical agent acting upon an inevitable tide, is a powerful and seductive one. It speaks to our desire for order, for the clarifying power of a singular vision. It paints a picture of the late Republic as a corpse, a state already dead from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, and Caesar as the necessary undertaker who simply signed the death certificate. This narrative allows us to see him as a tragic hero, a man burdened by his own genius, forced by circumstance to take on the weight of the world. But this is the great comfort of hindsight, the narrative that power always writes for itself. It smooths over the terrifying contingency of the moment. It forgets that for every action Caesar took, there was always another choice, another path. The path of compromise, the path of submission to law, the path of loyalty to the institutions he had sworn to uphold. The argument from necessity conveniently papers over the stark reality of his choices. His decision to use violence to overcome political opposition, his decision to corrupt the legal process for personal gain, and his ultimate decision to cross a sacred river and wage war upon his own country. He was not a passive agent of history. He was an active, willing, and brilliant destroyer of the world he found and the architect of the one he wanted. And the world he wanted was one centered entirely on himself. His reforms, however beneficial some may have been, were always, at their core, instruments for the consolidation of personal power. When he relieved debt, he was not just an economic reformer, he was a political arsonist, burning the ledgers of traditional patronage to make the entire populace dependent on him. When he founded colonies for his veterans, he was not just a social planner, he was a military strategist, planting garrisons of men whose loyalty was absolute, whose fortunes were tied directly to his own across the breadth of the empire. When he regularized the calendar, he was not just a scientist, he was a cosmologist, inserting his own family name into the fabric of time itself, making his life the measure of all things. This is the subtle, pervasive nature of his tyranny. It was not always the tyranny of the sword and the prescription list, though he was master of those as well. It was the tyranny of the gift, the tyranny of the pardon, the tyranny of the solution. He gave the people peace and stability, but the price was their sovereignty. He solved the problems of the Republic by abolishing the Republic itself, and in its place offered only his own will as the new constitution. The story of his rise and fall, therefore, becomes something more than just a sequence of events from a distant past. It is a recurring pattern, a timeless and unsettling parable written in the language of stone and steel. It is a warning. It speaks to the inherent fragility of any system of self-government, to the delicate balance between liberty and order, between the rule of law and the will of the majority. It reminds us that republics are not eternal. They are not monuments of granite that can withstand any storm. They are more like conversations, complex and often difficult dialogues between competing interests, held together by a shared faith in the rules of the conversation itself. They are built on norms, traditions, and a collective willingness to place the integrity of the system above the immediate gratification of a political victory. And Caesar's story is the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when those things begin to decay. His career is a field guide to the techniques of dismantling a free state from within. It begins with the weaponization of popular resentment against a corrupt but legitimate elite. It progresses with the slow normalization of political violence, the idea that a mob in the street can be a more effective tool than a vote in the Senate. It relies on the creation of a personal brand that transcends political office, fostering a loyalty that attaches to a man rather than to the state. It involves the systematic delegitimization of institutions, the courts, the legislature, the electoral process, portraying them as hopelessly broken and rigged, so that only the great leader can be trusted. And it culminates in the final, terrible choice, when the leader, cornered by the very laws he has spent a career subverting, decides that his personal honor is more important than the peace of his nation, and chooses to burn it all down rather than face accountability. This is the grim grammar of democratic collapse, and Caesar wrote its first and most compelling chapter. So we are left here, in the quiet of our own time, looking back across the immense gulf of 2 millennia. The dust has long since settled over the plains of Pharsalus and the bloody ground of Munda. The marble of the Forum is cold now, worn smooth by the footfalls of millions of tourists who walk unknowingly over the ashes of a civilization. The great theatre of Pompey, where Caesar fell, is a ruin, its outline barely visible in the tangle of apartments and restaurants that have grown up around it. The spot where his body was burned in the Forum, where a temple was later erected to the divine Julius, is now just a small roofed excavation, a humble scar on the face of a bustling modern city. The whispers of conspiracy have faded. The blood has been washed away by 2,000 years of rain. It is time to let the ghosts of the past rest. Our long journey through that turbulent, violent, and world-altering moment in time is now at an end. We have walked in the shadow of a man who bent the world to his will, and we have witnessed the terrible, enduring price of his singular ambition. The hour is late. The story is told. The world outside your window is, one hopes, a world at peace. Take a moment to appreciate the quiet. In the silence, you can almost hear the faint, distant echo of a choice being made, of a die being cast, of a free republic's slow and painful death. It is a reminder that the rights and systems we may take for granted were not easily won, and are more fragile than we can ever truly know. May your own institutions be strong, your laws be respected, and your leaders be servants, not masters. May you have the wisdom to see the difference. Sleep well. Good night.